All right, well, thanks for coming to this session. So this is Conditional Access Deep Dive. So my name's Joe Kaplan, and I guess I won't dwell on this for too long. I guess the thing that I will say that is a little different about me is that I'm an IT guy like most of the rest of you. I am not like a consultant, and I don't work for a product company either. So a lot of my experience comes from actually doing this for a large IT organization. I've worked at the same place for 25 years, which is kind of unusual. And it's a pretty interesting place to work at from an identity perspective. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about that later. Many years ago, I guess it's 12 years ago, I wrote this book that some of you may have. Sadly, this book is still relevant because .NET LDAP programming hasn't really changed very much over the years. So someone may still find it useful, and you can still buy it today. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We are going to spend some time going through conditional access features just in general, and then we're going to do a deeper dive on the device-based authentication and conditional access policy ecosystem. And the reason we're going to do that is that I find that part to be the most interesting, and I also think it's the part that you as IT guys are likely to spend the most time like fussing around with, trying to make work, because there's so much ecosystem to it. So that's kind of what the plan is. All right? Oh, and this is a build slide. All right, so this slide I actually stole from Microsoft. You can tell that this slide is professionally prepared. The rest of my slides are not this lovely. So you may have seen something like this at Ignite. Did anyone go to Ignite? Curiosity? No? Okay, well, maybe you didn't. You can watch this stuff online. It's on YouTube as well. But generally speaking, so we have this conditional access landscape, and we're going to get into a bunch of the details here. But show of hands, who's actually using conditional access right now? Got some people with some experience. So you know basically what we're talking about here. Okay, so conditional access is a feature in Azure Active Directory, and it allows you to control access to resources. It's a really, really rich policy engine. It has all these features and stuff, and basically we're going to go through and dissect some, but not all of the components of this, okay? I want to talk about licensing. There are lots of questions around this, but you have to buy this, and different pieces of it come in different places. So conditional access in general is an Azure AD P1 feature, which you also get with EMS3. And generally speaking, you have to have what Microsoft would refer to as full tenant licensing in order to be able to use it in good faith. If you have an organization like mine where you have 550,000 licensed users, the difference between that and one user is really, really big. But generally speaking, it's a P1 feature, and that's what's required to get in the door. We're also going to be talking about multi-factor authentication, which is also a P1 feature. And there's a fair bit of stuff related, especially in the device ecosystem, to Intune, which comes out of EMS. Additionally, there's the really fancy feature, Azure AD Identity Protection, or risk-based conditional access. This is the P2 feature, which is also available in EMS5. And so if you want to take advantage of this particular feature in the stack, you have to go up market one more time in order to get that. And that's, once again, a full tenant feature. There's also this special thing called custom controls. So I believe that this actually just recently changed. This was a P2 EMS5 feature, and they just changed it down to P1 EMS3. I found out about this because the TruSona sales guys like called me the other day and was like, hey, remember how you didn't have that, and maybe now you do, maybe you'd like to talk to us again. So I'm not actually going to talk about the custom control stuff very much in here because I don't know a whole lot about it, but there's an ecosystem of extensibility with some other vendor stuff in this space, and the interesting thing, I think, just from a licensing perspective, is that it just got moved down. Okay? Any questions, licensing?
One question.
Yeah?
The new control, Cloud Ops Security hookup.
Oh, so I'm not really going to cover CAS very much, so we'll mention a tiny little bit. So CAS is generally going to be an EMS5 feature, and yeah, I probably should just add that to the table. Yes. So, and you'll actually see that in some of the stuff as we go through it. Like I said, I'm not really going to talk about it too much, but CAS, in addition to being able to do the standalone CAS stuff that you can do where you are basically monitoring the APIs of your SaaS services, you can also use CA to implement session level controls on some supported systems and actually be able to control what happens within the app as opposed to just like the basic in or out type of stuff that we're typically doing. So, yes. Or you can buy it standalone. Well, so no. Well, it's a good question. So in order to use CAS, you have to have CAS licenses for all the people who are using CAS. I'm uncertain exactly. So most full tenant licensing is sort of the honor system because the first time you light up one of those things, it gets turned on in your tenant. It'll show up in CA, and then whether or not you're actually allowed to use session controls probably depends on what you have in place for licensing for those individuals. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Joe,
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to talk about custom controls?
No. No. I know absolutely nothing about it other than the fact that that TruSona is part of the ecosystem of custom controls. But yeah, other than having done some demos with it and played with it a little bit before, not an area that I have any experience in. Okay. So let's move on to some basic concepts. So what we're trying to do with conditional access, and I'll use a couple of examples that we have actually done within my company. So we have what we call this MFA all-in policy. And the idea here is whenever an Accenture employee is trying to access anything in Azure, they must perform multi-factor authentication. And so this is the kind of thing that you would generally want to implement with a conditional access rule. There's other ways to actually do MFA within the Azure stack. You can do it by user, but conditional access allows you essentially to do it based on conditional access policies and targeting specific things more at the app level. We'll get to targeting here in just a second. This is, as you think about your haikus, this is kind of the general prose that you want to build these things up in. So let me just kind of move on. I'm going to jump into some anatomy of a policy thing here. Anyway, let's start diving into the anatomy of a policy. Okay, so this is an actual Accenture policy that we're looking at a top level, and we'll use this to dissect things a little bit here. But essentially, and this is in fact our default all-in Azure MFA for everything policy that we use. So we'll talk about first how we're targeting things, like the users and applications that we're targeting and the actual conditions. And we'll go through some of the conditions. I'm not going to actually hit all of the conditions, but we will talk about some of them. And then, and so this basically controls like if this part of your equation, then the access controls are the then what happens, which is usually like grant access, block access, grant access, but do all these things and whatnot. So and this is the general overall shape of the policy framework as it's organized. Okay. So let's talk about targeting. So essentially, we target primarily based on users and applications, and Users can be a big mix of stuff in this model. So it's both it's basically all the users that you have in Azure AD, which can be users that are created directly in the cloud, users that are synced from on-prem. It's also all your guest users. So out of curiosity, who here is using B2B or is familiar with B2B? Got some B2B people here? Okay, so B2B users are also part of your conditional access ecosystem. The licensing model is like the magic 5-to-1 thing that's not actually counted, but you hope you don't exceed it, and it's sort of an honor system. But they're in this space and they can participate in your policies, and it's an important thing to kind of keep in mind. So, and the applications are basically all of your stuff that you have in Azure, and one of the things that we've looked at strategically is that we actually want to have all of our apps in Azure if we can, because this is a more useful place for us to be, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as we get to some of our stuff. But it's a mix of Office 365, other SaaS, your custom stuff, and anything that you happen to be doing with App Proxy. Curiosity, people know what App Proxy is? Azure App Proxy? Kind of, yeah? Okay, good. So a couple of things. So this is what the targeting stuff looks like. So when we're talking about users, we can do all, select, or so okay. So it's basically all or select, and when you're selecting, it looks like this. These things are also symmetric in terms of how you do your includes and excludes. There's just a couple of things that I do want to point out that are useful to look at here. So there's some new functionality that's been added recently where you can target guest users directly. This is incredibly helpful. There are certain things that you're going to probably want to do where you may wish to exclude guest users from certain things. Like, for example, let's say you wanted to MFA all your stuff, and you're also using Azure Information Protection. Azure Information Protection, when you send things outside of your org boundary, doesn't really work very well with guest users. If you force them to MFA, because a lot of those guest users may not actually be guests in your tenant, and they can't register, and so this won't work. So you will potentially, if you are trying to go all in on MFA, want to do something like have a carve out for AIP as its own special cloud app, and disable MFA for guest users, because it's just not going to work. But this makes it easy to do that. Otherwise, you would have needed a different mechanism. You can also do directory roles now as well, too, which is pretty handy. We haven't used that for anything yet internally, but it's an additional layer of abstraction. You can use that around a lot of your administrative stuff as well, which should make things more helpful. One other thing I'm going to point out here, this is kind of just sort of an overall best practice thing. We have these firefighter accounts for PIM. These are cloud-only accounts that we use for break glass emergencies. These are excluded from the MFA policy, and so this is when the stuff hits the fan and we're in really big trouble. Like all of our on-prem stuff is down or whatnot. Somebody is supposed to be able to go in and get this thing, and you want to probably make sure that you don't have an MFA barrier in place. I would also recommend that you don't manage your exclusions this way. You probably want them all in one Azure AD-based group and not have them kind of scattered all over the place. But generally speaking, make sure you've got a backdoor if you're going all in on MFA with some kind of an admin account. All right?
You separate your admin accounts from your regular users when it comes to applying, like managed accounts versus a normal regular Office account.
So, yeah, so we do internally. We have a policy that says that you have to have a separate administrator account. Generally speaking, all of our separate administrator accounts are on-prem and synced back to the cloud, and most of them are doing things like smart card login on-prem. So using that model, because we're still very on-prem focused for all of our provisioning stuff. The ones I just showed you are actually cloud only because they're specifically break glass for Azure, because we didn't want to take a dependency on anything having to do with on-prem at the moment when we actually think we need those. The most interesting thing is like what thing do we go get them out of, and does that still open when we when we need that? We'll see. Hopefully it never happens. Let's talk about targeting applications a little bit. So this is actually generally pretty pretty straightforward. I actually do not know what it does when you select none. I've just not really thought about that. But generally speaking, you're going to either select all cloud apps or you're going to select specific apps. Almost all of our policies are either all cloud apps or some combination. You can also do all cloud apps except this one, which it makes it really handy. Microsoft was kind enough to put this little hazard warning on here. If you do an all cloud apps policy, you want to be really, really careful that you make sure that you have the appropriate backdoors in place such that you don't lock yourself out. And I will just reiterate that. And yeah. And we already talked a little bit about the ecosystem of things that you can do with this, but it's basically all this stuff. So just to talk a little bit about us at Accenture. So we have we were kind of, I would say, the OG ADFS shop, and we have now like lots and lots and lots and lots of apps integrated with our on-prem ADFS, like 5,000 in production. It's a pretty insane number. One of the real sad things about that is because all of those apps are integrated with on-prem, we can't use them as targets for conditional access. So one of the things we'd actually like to do is shift that entire workload to the cloud, have all those things directly integrated up here so that we can actually take advantage of these things. But my recommendation to you is that you not make the same mistake that we did and use this surface area as the place where you do all of your custom line of business applications. And use App Proxy as well too for your legacy apps that you want to project into the cloud.
Proxy not a solution for your situation with your 5,000?
They're all modern auth apps.
Oh.
So they're all public-facing modern auth apps. It's just that they want claims from ADFS and not from Azure AD. And the interesting thing about the migration there is that it's pretty hard to make Azure AD issue the exact same claims that ADFS does, which makes it hard to migrate the apps without changing them. Like in theory, it should be like exactly super easy. It's like it's a modern auth app. You just script it, but in practice, it's actually not that easy. So we'll see how we do with that. We actually have a funded project to do that this year. But any questions on targeting? I'm going to jump over to conditions. So the ones that are highlighted, we'll drop down into a little bit more detail. But these are the additional conditions that we can select on. So things that are interesting that I will point out here before we don't talk about it any further is that device state is a new feature that's been added recently, and as is client app. And device state is now both a condition and a control. So you can actually select based on whether devices are domain joined or compliant, as well as enforce that as a control. So it's an interesting new thing. But yeah, we're not going to otherwise talk about that.
Is that a claim? Is it a claim?
So we'll talk about a little bit more about how it works in the overall ecosystem. But essentially, yeah, at the end of the day, if you have state related to the device, it ends up being a claim in the pipeline that's used for processing. And I do have some stuff where you talk about actual how the device authentication works a little bit later on. So maybe we'll hold off on that and then loop back around to it later. Okay. So we're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on Azure AD identity protection. This is a really, really interesting part of the platform. There was actually an entire session at HIP last year that was all just on this, that went really deep on it. And I'm only going to highlight it a little bit. But one of the things that I would like to point out about it is that as a selector, it's really, really, really straightforward. You basically just have these different categories of risk that can be used. So if this is a high-risk login, or if this is a high and a medium risk, and I like how they're all individually selected. So you could have like a high-risk login and a no-risk login. You can create gobbledygook pretty easily with this, but you have a lot of options. But so this is by far the most interesting part of the platform, but this is kind of a black box to you as an IT person. Basically, Microsoft identifies the risk being whatever they use to describe it, and then that's the signal that's in the pipeline at this time that you can use for selecting on your policy. Okay, so device targeting. This is basically, so the supported platforms for targeting devices are these. So we have Android, iOS, Windows Phone, which is still in the UI, but not otherwise in circulation. I have a whole bag of broken Windows Phones at home. It's really embarrassing. But I was, yeah, I'm done with that now. I hope you are too. And Windows and Mac OS. So one of the things that is interesting here is that you can also target unsupported platforms like Linux. And so you can actually, they can be detected and they can be basically blocked. You can't actually, you can't reason against them because there's no device auth support for them, but you can actually block them if they are detected. And you can use the, including all supported, you can also add an exclusion to do some interesting things with that as well too. Okay? Location. So location allows you to do things based on IP ranges and countries, and this is an actual policy, so I've actually redacted it. This is the Accenture internal network, and I'll actually show you something that we use this for, but you configure your trusted locations, and then you can use them within your policies and do things to target things based on all sorts of stuff related to this. It is probably a good idea to define within your organization, if you know what your egress IPs are, to be able to tell Azure that, because you can use that for a bunch of interesting things. So I would definitely recommend that if you have some sort of a way to reason over those, that you put that stuff in. I'll show you a quick example of something that we actually did with this. So we had this app. And this app was really secure. Everyone was super afraid of it. And we kept it inside the corporate network because we would never put this on the public internet, except that we wanted to add some CA-based controls to it. Because we also wanted to be able to do things like, we want to make sure that you can't get to this thing with with anything except a managed or compliant device. And it's just like it's just a website that you use to manage this thing. So it was difficult to apply those controls without CA. So what we did was we decided, let's put Azure App Proxy on it, and so that we can actually add CA controls to it. Okay, so now the problem is that our super secure app is now on the public internet because everything in Azure App Proxy is on the public internet. And so people are like, this is terrible, it's on the public internet now. And so what we were actually able to do is we were able to create a CA policy that says that you must be on the corporate network in order to access this. So even though the App Proxy app is actually public facing, CA will make it such that you have to access it from within the corporate within the corporate network. And it's just one of those crazy CA tricks that you can do with this. And this was actually satisfactory to the security overlords. They were like, yeah, okay, that sounds pretty reasonable. They tested it, nobody could break it, and it worked as expected. One of the things you will sometimes see in your CA policies is you have to think about the logic backwards. So what happens here is that we're actually blocking access unless you are in this selected network. So no one can get access unless you are in this selected IP range, and that's how it works. So sometimes as you're sort of reasoning over your policies, whether you're doing a grant or block, you'll have to sort of think about, like, what are the options that I'm given in terms of how I can create that, and do I have to invert the logic? Let us jump over to controls. There's an excellent chance that I'm going to run out of time if I don't hurry, so I'm going to try and speed up a little bit, and then we'll jump over to device auth. But so there's a whole bunch of controls that you can apply, and we'll talk about a few of them. So we're going to talk a little bit about MFA, and we're going to talk about mostly about these things coming up next. The stuff that we're not going to talk about for the rest of the talk, so I will just mention now, are obviously you can just do allow and block, and sometimes you may just want a conditional access policy that says block everyone unless they're in this group. Just basic user-based authorization. Super easy, can just do it. You don't have to do all this other crazy fancy stuff and get interesting usage out of it. But allow and block is always there. Terms of use, this is something that in order to satisfy your GDPR people, you probably need to be able to pop up with terms of use, and you can do that. You can create one. You can have all your guest users agree to a terms of use or they won't be able to sign in. It's a pretty interesting, useful thing. It makes the lawyers happy, and it's built into the platform. You can take advantage of it. You can have different terms of use for different people. If you need to TOU your employees versus your guests with different TOUs, then you can do that stuff. So that's in there. We talked a little bit about the custom controls, and once again, we will not talk about them again. Approved app is a new feature which I haven't played with at all yet, but there's like a list of specific apps that can be approved for usage within a specific application, and so you can use that in here now. Reset passwords a control. This is typically used in risk-based login scenarios. You can actually force people to change their password as part of a flow to be able to get into an app if you detect that there's something that you don't like about them. And then we have the session controls, CAS. Like for supported applications like Office 365, I can actually force you into this special tunnel and do more interesting stuff inside of the application after you log in. Okay? So those are the things we're not going to talk about. This is, you actually see we don't have all the features lit up in our side because we don't have AIP configured because we haven't bought it yet. So this is an actual screen from us. But this shows you basically how you're able to select the various controls. All right, let us jump ahead. So MFA. Not going to talk a whole lot about how one would actually go about deploying MFA. That's a whole separate topic. I would definitely recommend that everyone has MFA and deploy it broadly across your organization. There's a lot of options for how you can go about doing it. Typically, most people are going to use Azure MFA because it's there, and that's the thing that you will see. However, you do have some options related to this. For federated, if your users are actually doing federated sign-in against Azure AD, you can actually use the MFA that's in ADFS. There's a flag on your MSOL domain federation settings for a given federated domain that allows you to say this particular federated system supports MFA. And then what Azure AD will do is anytime it needs to MFA you, it just sends you back to on-prem and will MFA you there. And if you have like some custom stuff that you've implemented in ADFS to do that, which is actually what we have, all your MFA is there, and ADFS actually just vouches for you. This one is kind of neat too. Windows Hello for Business is MFA, which is awesome. It is treated as MFA by Azure AD. Okay? So before we get into the device part, I think I'm doing okay on time. A couple of things I just want to point out. So generally speaking, a lot of your troubleshooting is going to come from the logs. The logs have gotten a lot better recently. So this is just the standard Azure AD sign-in log. One of the things, there's like a kind of a pro tip in here. A lot of times you won't actually have all these drop-downs and selectors. If you hit the columns button, and there's a little fan out that shows up there. If you select additional columns, you get all of these other filtering things, which you can then use to see in the logs. But one of the important things is showing conditional access failures and successes, and you can dig into your actual sign-in reports and see which policy failed and which one was applied and whatnot. So the other thing is the what if tool. The what if tool is pretty interesting. There's some things you can't really test with the what if tool, like a lot of device auth scenarios depend on device auth actually working, which is more of a device operational problem than a what if analysis tool. But what if analysis is actually incredibly useful for making sure that you have at least some sort of an idea of what a policy is going to do. And it's in the UI. You should definitely use it. Not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but yeah, just play with it and try and use that before you make interesting changes broadly, so that you don't get fired. Or you don't lock yourself out, or there's lots of bad things that can happen with interesting stuff. One of the things that we actually have to do internally, it's a little sad, but being a big IT shop, we actually have a an Azure AD change review board that meets every week where we actually review changes and people talk about them and make sure that nobody's proposing to do something stupid. And it's sad that we needed that, but we needed that because we were having some problems with like too many administrators and too many people deploying stuff and not necessarily knowing what was about to happen, especially the Intune guys. They're a little out of control. So I'm not sure that everyone needs a governance review board, but it may be useful. Okay, so let's talk a little bit switch over to the device part of what we want to talk about here today. So the reason why device state is so important is that devices can be compromised. So even if I've like MFA'd the user, if the device is compromised and there's some malware on the device that's actually able to hijack the login session, then I may not actually know that my login is still any good. So clean, reliable devices are actually an incredibly important thing. This was something we could not really do before. So the power of this model is really is one of the things that I'm most excited about. We just could not take the device into account in terms of our policies because we didn't know what the device was. We only really actually knew who the user was. So I talked a little bit about this stuff, but just to get a little bit of a flavor of a bunch of the things that we've done. So yeah, we're a big company. We have like about 500,000 users or so. We have so much turnover in our company that we will hire at least 50,000 people just to keep our head count where it is. So if you can imagine the HR machine that's required to hire 50,000 people globally, it's a crazy thing that we go through every year. It's a really interesting place to work from an identity perspective because it's just so big and the churn is so high. And yeah, I already talked a little bit about the ADFS stuff, and we were kind of, I would say, the OG sort of B2B SaaS company. So we very early on decided that we would put things on the public internet and make all of our stuff public facing. It's really good for a consulting company because our consultants are like in other people's buildings and networks all the time, and having stuff be public facing made it much easier for them to be able to do the stuff that they needed to do. Like once they needed a VPN, they were basically hosed because the client networks were going to block that probably. So we've been all in on this sort of cloud thing for a really long time. Like I said, we have some growing pains now trying to move to the actual cloud and not our own cloud. But we're still pretty well geared towards this model. And so the big things that we've done in the Azure space, we do have this MFA all-in policy. Like everything that's Azure is MFA all the time, no matter what. And that's whether you're in the corporate network or not, everything is MFA. There are some exclusions for things like service accounts and some of those break glass things, but generally speaking, that is always on for everything. The other thing that we did, which I'm pretty proud of, is that we require you to use a hybrid domain joined device to use the Outlook native client. And getting that working on 500,000 machines was also a pretty interesting thing to make work. So I'm going to switch over to talking about device authentication, and we'll start to go into this in a little bit more detail now. See, I have 20 minutes. Okay, so we're going to go hopefully somewhat quickly through this, but. So in order to do device-based authorization, you have to authenticate the device. If you don't know what the device is, you can't reason over it. So a lot of the plumbing that's involved in this stuff is related to making the actual device authentication stuff work within Azure. And what I really want you to understand is actually how that works and understand a little bit about the provisioning and the data model so that you'll come out of here with having it be a little less of a mystery. Because like I said, as IT guys, this is the thing that you will probably spend the most time fussing with to make work, especially at a large scale, as opposed to something like risk, which is more of a black box. All right, so first off, let's talk a little bit about registration. So in order for you to authenticate, you have to be registered. And so everything has to be registered across all those supported device types. So Windows 10 has the most options related to it. And just out of curiosity, how many people are still on Windows 7 versus Windows 10? Migrating. So, okay, yeah, we fully migrated to Windows 10, but I think we still have like 30,000 Windows 7 machines. So I don't know what happened there. The migration was checked off and they declared victory, but they would still have a bunch of Windows 7 left. So the things to know are that you have the hybrid join model, which I think is what most people will likely be doing. Anyone playing with Azure AD Join? A little bit? Yeah, this is something that we've only just kind of started playing with as well too. You also have, we'll talk a little bit about like co-management stuff a bit later. And you also have Add Worker School Account, which exists. Generally speaking, Add Worker School Account is not going to do much from a CA perspective unless you're also going to Intune manage people's personal machines, which you may or may not do. But generally speaking, that ends up sort of outside of the equation because those devices are neither compliant nor domain joined from the perspective of CA, which are your two checkboxes, okay? You can still do down level if you have the right software deployed and you turn on the right GPOs. So if you have Windows 7 or 8.1, it's there. For mobile, it's Intune, so the way your devices are going to get registered this way, and also with Mac. Anyone done any of the Mac Intune stuff yet? Just out of curiosity, we're just starting to kick the tires on that now as well too. And I'm waiting to see if this really works correctly. I'm very, very hopeful that our Jamf Intune pseudo co-management thing is an actual reality, but. Your settings, so this is related to the non-hybrid stuff, but in case anyone was wondering where the settings are, here's the stuff for Azure AD Join, and here's the stuff for Add Worker School Account. For some reason, we don't require multi-factor auth to join Add Worker School Account. That's probably a security posture hole, so I'm just going to move on past that slide because it's a little embarrassing, but that is our actual screenshot. So let me talk a little bit about what happens in the registration flow. And essentially, there's hybrid and there's everything else. And hybrid is probably the most magical thing. So we'll spend a little bit more time on that. But essentially, what happens here is that there's kind of a two-stage thing. And what we're really talking about in this first part is how the actual device gets itself registered in Azure AD. So typically, the device, which is a Windows 10 device, and hopefully it's 1709 or higher, is going to see that the policies are enabled. They're enabled by default, so unless you turn them off, they will be on. And then it will actually look to see if you've configured this correctly in your Active Directory, so you have the service connection point properly deployed and whatnot. You ran the right PowerShells to do that. And if all this stuff is set up, then the device will authenticate, and it will typically authenticate against ADFS. If you have a non-ADFS environment, apparently this also now works directly against Azure AD in some magic that I don't totally understand, but there's a way that can be made to work. And once it authenticates and basically gets a token that it can use to go talk to Azure AD, it will go up to Azure AD and then say, I want to register. Azure AD will issue it a certificate, and the device then gets a certificate which gets enrolled on the machine for that particular device. And this is a cert that's issued by Azure AD. So by the way, there is another model that still exists that you should never ever use, the enterprise join thing where you register stuff in ADFS instead of Azure AD. So I'm hoping that no one ever does that or has to think about doing that. I'm not going to even mention it again. Hopefully everyone is just doing hybrid, and that's the only thing that you're interested in. So anyway, that's how the device actually registered, and then the user part comes along later during login. So everything else is usually some sort of an interactive thing, like Add Worker School Account. You click the button, that you log in, and it goes off to Azure AD and authenticates you. You end up with the certificate on the device. It's a similar experience for Mac and mobile. Okay, and basically, at this point, you have a certificate that you have acquired. Hopefully, in the hybrid case, this is also TPM protected, if you have a TPM on the device. Any questions? Okay, So I have a grab bag of examples. This is also a screenshot out of a real page of our stuff. So you see we have a big mix of devices out here. Most of the stuff is hybrid Azure AD joined. We also have some mobile devices. We have some stuff that's Intune managed. You can probably tell by looking at this that we are not using co-management. I don't know if people know what Intune co-management is with SCCM. We're still in the process of deploying that. If we had that, these would all say Microsoft Intune, and they would all hopefully say compliant. But I currently don't have the ability in my model to do compliance on Windows 10 machine. I can only do the hybrid Azure AD join selector. Okay, but you also, so in any event, this is a place too that you will probably be spending some time. If you have a large environment, you may also be doing some scripting to clean up stale devices, much like you clean up old computers out of your Active Directory today. This is another thing that is left as a as a exercise for the administrator to perform because they will kind of hang around forever. Okay, let's see how we're doing. Oh my gosh, we're running out of time. So let's talk, I want to talk a little bit about how does something actually get to be domain joined. So this applies to the hybrid join use case specifically. And what I want to do here is actually show you a little bit. So anyone familiar with Graph API? Hopefully, so I would actually encourage everyone to learn a little bit about Graph API. It's a really powerful thing. If you like LDAP and you like Azure, then you need to learn Graph API because it's your new friend. This is where all the data is, and the ability to actually get to all the data and see it in the actual underlying data model is incredibly powerful and useful. So the main thing is, as we kind of go through this flow, the bottom line is that the machine gets to be set as domain joined as part of this specific flow. And so when it registers with itself, this state gets set within Azure AD, and it is flagged as hybrid joined from there on out. And I'll talk about right back in a second, but these attributes will then flow back to on-prem. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about compliance. So how do things actually get to be compliant? So the answer is generally Intune, Intune, Intune across the board. And so Intune's actually changed quite a lot since last year at HIP. Intune is now, actually, this is a real thing. You can really do this on Macs. This was something that was just kind of being talked about back then. And you also have Intune. You can do pure Intune if you're doing pure modern management for your Windows workstations. You can also do the co-management stuff as well too. But generally speaking, Intune is the thing that is going to mark your stuff as compliant. Okay?
Quick question. What's the benefit of using Jamf plus Intune?
So Jamf. So I'm not a Mac administrator.
Jamf is the SCCM for pretty much, right? But what's the benefit of adding Intune to it?
So my workstation admin guys who do Mac stuff will tell me that Intune is kind of a joke in terms of what you can do in terms of managing stuff. And if you already have a Jamf deployment and you depend on the controls that it's offering, you're going to want to continue to use Jamf as the MDM. By the way, there's an interesting thing in this model. On Windows, there's SCCM and there's Intune, and Intune is the MDM. And Mac, Jamf is actually the MDM, and Intune is not the MDM. It's just like kind of off to the side doing a little bit of extra stuff.
But can you take advantage of the conditional access?
Yes.
Okay.
In theory, you can. In practice, I've not tested this yet. I'm waiting to see. But the expectation is that you will get your devices registered, and they will show up as compliant within this ecosystem. And so the compliance decision is made by Intune. The devices all have to be phoning home periodically and have to check out against your Intune compliance policies. These things can change. Like if a device that was compliant can go out of compliance, and then any policies that you have that are based on a requirement of compliance will start to fail. And so getting familiar with Intune, like Intune is the way forward for all things. This is one of the things that I've been learning as I've gotten more into devices, is that I'm going to have to learn a lot more about Intune than I ever really wanted to, because it is it is the road through which all this travels. Okay, so I got a couple more minutes and a couple more slides. Let me see if I can sort of finish this out. Let me talk a little bit about how authentication works. So essentially, there's special magic in Windows 10, and then there's kind of the way everything else works. And the authentication is important because this is the step at which we're authenticating with Azure AD, and the identity of the device gets to be known in addition to the identity of the user. And this is how we can actually reason over the device. If we do not authenticate it, we do not know what it is, because all that state is stored in Azure AD. We have to be able to match it up with an identifier to be able to find out if it's a hybrid join machine, or if it's compliant, or if we don't know anything about it at all. Okay? So there is this whole subsystem that is built into Windows 10. It used to be referred to as the token broker, the web authentication manager, but there's plumbing that's built into Windows 10 that deals in these things called primary refresh tokens. And essentially, it's like Kerberos, but for the internet. And there's actually two primary refresh tokens that you could have. There's one for Azure AD and there's one for on-prem. Maybe we'll see if we have a little bit of time to talk about the on-prem stuff. But the bottom line here is that your authentication is generated based off of this primary refresh token that is acquired from Azure AD periodically. It's like a curb ticket, so it expires, it has to be refreshed, and the machine has to be reaching out and going to Azure AD to get one of these things. And it's authenticating with a combination of information about the device and the current logged in user. Okay? Everything else is using the client certificate, and it's basically TLS based. Okay? Going quickly here. So how it works through a policy check, I kind of want to gloss over this a little bit because I want to get to a few of the last things here at the end. But essentially, during the authentication, so the Windows 10 devices are going to authenticate with the token broker. And one of the other things with client TLS is that client TLS is not always done in all cases. Client TLS may be done just when it's required. So only when a policy actually requires it, the device will get a client TLS check against the certificate. That's probably the only thing that's really super important to know there. This is just sort of a pro tip. There are some customization and customizability features within conditional access. One of the things that we were having trouble with is that the standard "you can't get there from here" error message was really frustrating to our end users. And as it turns out, you can actually customize some of the error messages for specific use cases, especially for Windows 10 and browser-based apps, where you can actually create your own web page and give people additional information if their device isn't working correctly. How do they bootstrap themselves out of this and whatnot? I'm not going to actually tell you exactly how to do that, but you can look it up online. Basically, there's some like PowerShell stuff against Azure AD that you can use to configure some of these policies, and you have to deploy your own website to do it. But it's just a static content page, no big deal. I believe so, and if it's not, Nitika will find it for us, and she'll be able to tell us the exact way. Can you the PowerShell to configure that particular policy customization? You got that for me? All right. So a few closing things. So we talked a little bit about on-prem. One of the things that's really, really interesting with device-based authentication, especially hybrid join, is the ability for Azure AD Connect to do write back, and then for ADFS, if you're on ADFS 4, to also do device-based authentication, and then potentially also do use ADFS authorization policies to check things like domain joined or compliant. And so basically what happens here is that if you have write back enabled, all of your registered devices that you register in Azure will end up back on-prem in the container of your choosing, which is usually CN equals registered devices at the top of your domain partition. And these devices, the objects will have basically the same data in them that they have in Azure AD. Additionally, they should be set up so that you can do token broker-based authentication for Windows 10 devices against ADFS 4 as well too. So this whole ecosystem will work. So we talked a little bit about the Azure AD PRT, primary refresh token, that you get against Azure AD. ADFS will also issue primary refresh tokens to Windows 10 devices for on-prem login. And this stuff basically can all be made to work on-prem and take advantage of this with your on-prem ecosystem. Okay? A quick thing on Hello for Business. I mentioned this before. This is a feature, I'm really, really excited about this. I think Hello for Business actually should just be called MFA without passwords, because I think it is a more descriptive thing about what it really is. But it is MFA without passwords. And the thing that is interesting is that it's really layered on top of this whole device-based login ecosystem. So basically, Azure AD will treat, when you log in with Hello for Business, your Azure AD PRT all kind of works the same, except that your PRT also tells Azure AD that you're MFA. So your MFA just flows directly into the cloud as if all of your users had all magically MFA'd already. And the same thing works on-prem. If you're doing device-based authentication against ADFS, ADFS will treat your enterprise PRT that you acquire as having MFA creds against it, and you're not using any passwords. So it's a really interesting technology. It's a way to sort of broaden your MFA and your usability of MFA within your environment by putting this out there.
Just a quick question. Are you guys using this at Accenture?
We're trying to use this at Accenture. There's a bridge call to troubleshoot our current failed POC that was during the break that I almost joined. I was so desperate to try and make it work, but I was like, no, I really, yeah. If you find yourself troubleshooting hybrid join stuff, and you look at this command that you might run on a Windows 10 workstation, DSREGCMD/status, there's a couple of, so there's a bunch of gobbledygook in here, and I've highlighted some of the things that are going to be mostly useful to you to know. So the first thing is an Azure AD join, yes. The device ID, so this is a fun fact. The device ID is always the object GUID of the domain computer object. And that's why it's always immutable. So if you unregister a device and re-register it, it always gets the same GUID. It's that GUID, and you can use that in your LDAP plumbing to go find stuff, which is kind of cool. Key sign test passed. If your TPM stuff is messed up, that will fail, and then your login will be broken, and you will have to fix something. You have to run that as admin to get that to work. Your tenant ID and all this stuff is in there is good, and you'll also see that this thing is domain joined. This is your user state. If your WAM default is not set, your device authentication is not going to work, and you have more stuff to do. And this shows you which PRTs you have. Do you have an Azure AD PRT? Yes. Do you have an enterprise PRT? No. This is off my actual workstation, and this is the reason we cannot get our Hello for Business to work, is because we cannot get ADFS to issue Azure our enterprise PRTs. So, and this is this thing, NGC prerequisite check. NGC is Hello for Business. That's a code lingo. If you want to know if your machine will actually enroll in Hello for Business, the prereq checks have to come out to will provision, and if you don't, it's not going to work. So in any event, that's it. I'm a minute over. Does anyone have any additional questions? Hopefully this was interesting and useful information for everyone, and I appreciate you guys coming.